So I've been authorized today to talk to you about class. And most specifically, I want to talk to you about class composition as a call to arms. Now, in general, there are several different aspects to class. There is the orthodox Marxist notion of class composition, which we're all familiar with. There are the Marxist and other expansions to class composition. But then there is also the rejection of orthodox class composition. And in the end, I actually want to advocate for a return to the orthodox Marxist understanding of class composition. So with that, we should ask the question, what is the orthodox Marxist notion or concept of class composition? In this case, it's very simple. Two main things: the bourgeois and the proletariat. The bourgeois control the means of production. They control the factories, they control the supply lines, they control the stores. They control the ways by which people reproduce themselves. Which is to say, they control the ways by which you feed yourself, you clothe yourself, you get a home, you get a family, you have your entertainment. The bourgeois ultimately control the means of humanity's production. And as such, because they control the means of production, directly and indirectly, they are the ruling class. Where, in the case of Chile, the business leaders are simply the rulers, it's quite clear that the bourgeois are the ruling class. But here as well, one cannot be elected to president, to Senate, to the House of Representatives without the funding necessary. And as Engels says, in liberal democracy, capital rules indirectly, and through that, all the more surely. So again, under classic orthodox Marxist conceptions, the bourgeois owns the means of production and is the ruling class. And opposed to them, there is the proletariat, the workers. Those who do not own the means of production. Those that are forced to sell their bodies and their lives hour by hour in order to gain a modicum of subsistence. A few hours of pleasure at a movie. A vestige of an education from a public state school. These are the workers. And because they do not own the means of production, they are, in any normal circumstance, at the mercy of those who do. Of the bosses, of the managers, or even indirectly to the investment bankers who issue loans that cause their companies, their stores that they work at, to collapse. Again, they do not own the means of production, and because they don't own the means of production, they're not the ruling class. But the proletariat have a very special characteristic, which is they also can be the revolutionary class. As Marx famously said in the Communist Manifesto, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." The reproduction of capital for profit, for exploitation, pushes more and more workers, as we're seeing now through this economic downturn, to the edge and the brink of bankruptcy, poverty, and destruction. The proletariat in orthodox class composition is the revolutionary class. However, we notice through historical contingencies, the industrial factory worker is almost rarely the only revolutionaries. They are rarely as a class the only revolutionaries. Which leads us to three main contributions to the notion of class analysis. Those by Lenin, those by Trotsky, and those by Mao. Lenin, of course we know, the radical theorist and revolutionary of Russia, later to become the Soviet Union, argued that the peasants themselves can contingently become a revolutionary class. Peasants as a class are individual farmers exploited either directly or indirectly by landlords. Either they work the landlord's land, or they are subject to complex social arrangements so that large landowners ultimately control how their goods go to market. So Lenin noticed that these peasants who work and slave and toil under either feudal or semi-feudal conditions, which is to say they have a lord or a landlord who basically exploits them, can enter into a temporary alliance with the proletariat, a temporary alliance with the industrial workers to defeat the ruling class, aristocrats and capitalists. But then they ultimately need to make that transition from a peasant, an individual landowner or someone who works someone else's land for their own production, into an agricultural worker. That is, someone who works, but they themselves do not directly own the means of production. The idea being that we get rid of individually owned farms, nationalize them, and make them state-run farms, of which the peasants become essentially agricultural proletariat, farm workers. And so, of course, this is an important distinction. Mexican immigrants today are not peasants. They do not work for a tithe. They do not work for a feudal lord. They are agricultural proletariat. They work in the factory farm. So, again, this is an important distinction between someone who is exploited and someone who works, and their relation to the means of production. For a peasant, they have a direct relation, but then they are exploited, Their goods, a percentage of their harvest is taken from them. Now, for Lenin, again, he believed that they could be temporary allies, but then they would ultimately need, to convert to proletariat, which, of course, happened under Stalin and collectivization. But he also noticed another interesting feature of the proletariat and another sort of class, which is the labor aristocracy. And those of you who are here for the Lenin lecture will certainly remember this. Imperialism, that invades other countries is able to bring materials and products back in. And not just concrete material, like invasion of, for example, the British Empire that invades a country and puts troops and then puts people to work, but also imperialism through capital. For example, in Ethiopia, where we sent over a bunch of investment funds, brought the price up, and then sold it all off, There are ways to imperialize besides soldiers. And, of course, Lenin believed that you can just invest capital in a country and ultimately bleed it dry. A good example, again, would be Mexico. We don't have many American soldiers on Mexican soil, but yet they are still bound to us through our investments, through our corporations, through our financial capital. Now, an interesting thing happens to these imperialist nations. They get extra. They get a surplus that they could just give to themselves, as the capitalists, but they notice that if they distribute this surplus from imperialism a little better among the workers, give them just a little bit more, a little bit cheaper television, a little bit cheaper food, these workers lose their revolutionary core. They become satisfied with their daily existence, which is still alienating, which is still filled with mindless labor. But the very fact that they could have 2 cars, their own house, essentially buys them off. This is what Lenin calls as a class, the labor aristocracy. And so, of course, even though they have the form of the proletariat, they are in fact not a revolutionary class. They've been bought off. This leads us to Trotsky. After Lenin died and Stalin came to lead the Soviet Union, Trotsky believed that there was a rise of a new class in the Soviet Union. That the ruling elites could themselves become a new class even if they did not directly control the means of production. Whereas a capitalist owns a factory or owns stock in the corporation that owns the factory, the bureaucrat is simply a manager. simply a leader. And so these bureaucrats form a parasitic political class that manages the mechanisms of the state, that manages the mechanisms of the economy, even though they don't have direct control over the exploitation of it. This would be the normal conception people have of the Soviet Union, is that there were these bureaucrats or apparatchik, leaders or officials who didn't live super well, but were parasitic upon the Soviet workers. So Trotsky posits this new, bureaucratic class. This leads us then to Mao. And Mao makes a radical break from all the previous class conceptions. The grounding of this is that Mao believed that contradictions between the classes could be antagonistic, necessarily settled through violent means, or they could be non-antagonistic. There could be different class interests between, for example, the proletariat and the peasants, but this didn't necessarily need to end in bloodshed or the subjugation and domination of one class by another. He believed, by extension, that other classes could engage in revolutionary activity so long as they did so independent of their class as such that they joined the working class. And one of the key ways in which this sort of revolutionary classes, who were not the proletariat, occurred for Mao was in anti-imperialism. When imperialism threatens an entire nation, all or many of the classes who would have conflicting class interests, the national bourgeois with the peasants, with the workers, with the bureaucrats, find a common enemy in the imperialist nation. And as a matter of fact, in China, what happened is the national bourgeois, the Chinese factory owners, the Chinese store owners, landowners, worked as a revolutionary class with the peasants, with the proletariat, against the foreign invaders. Initially the European powers, and then later, during the 30s and 40s, against the Japanese. Now the reason why this is such a radical break is that other classes can be revolutionary. They don't simply need to be suppressed or converted into proletarians. So it's this radical contingency of Mao that opens up a whole new conception for traditional orthodox Marxist class theory. However, there are several notions of class composition that reject orthodox class structure. There's consumptive models, there's post-structuralist models, and there's also sociological models. The consumptive models, workers are differentiated by their consumptive capacity. Because first world workers and third world workers are fundamentally a different class because they have access to different consumptive powers. Now this is very popular among some sociologists, but also you can find it in people who are avowed Marxists. Guy Debord says that yes, all the factory workers are proletarians when they're in the factory, but when they go home, they engage in the same bourgeois consumption of films, of music, of art, of television, of sports, that the ruling class do. It's just a matter of quantity, not of quality. This notion of class, consumptive, consumptive ability, consumptive goods, as an organizing factor of class is very popular among the ultra-left. The Red Army faction, of course, fiercely criticizing the German workers for simply going to their shopping malls and their theaters and their discotheques rather than expressing unity either together or with third world workers. And so they viewed one of the ways to end this is to end consumption or to threaten consumption, to firebomb supermarkets. And so for them, they think that modern capital is more based on consumers than it is on producers. This, of course, leads to other responses, like the post-structuralists. For them, class as a structure cannot account for our current situation. Class as an idea or a grand narrative, for them, is as bankrupt as any grand narrative, be it God guiding history, or the Hegelian notion of progress, or the notion of survival of the fittest, right? These sort of structural explanations are ultimately flawed. And so what they want to do is they want to analyze our current situation free of structures. And at the forefront of this interpretation of class is Negri and Hart. As they say in their book Empire, the proletariat is not what it used to be, but that does not mean it has vanished. It means rather that we are forced once again to face the analytic task of to understand the new composition of the proletariat as a class. The fact that under the category of proletariat we understand all of those exploited by and subject to capitalist domination should not indicate that the proletariat is a homogeneous class or undifferentiated unit. So in this case, for Negri and Hart, what it means to be a proletariat is to be exploited by capital, or as they later come to call it, empire. So we are all exploited by capital in different ways. A first world IT worker is exploited by capital, as well as a starving refugee in Darfur. It is their very resistance and exploitation by capital that renders them a proletariat. You'll notice this completely avoids the notion of class structure, especially those found in orthodox Marxism, right, as those who are related to the means of production. So in this case, for them, the real nature of class, if there is such a thing, is an interplay of powers either for or against the oppressor. And this, of course, they get from Michel Foucault, especially History of Sexuality, Volume 1, which is there are forces and centers of power always at war. You have Saddam Hussein as a state power, you have the United States, right, as an imperialist power. But also you have NGOs who accuse Saddam of human rights violations, NGOs who accuse the United States of doctoring information. You have the United Nations both as an authorizer of force, as an inspecting force. And so you have all of these centers of power that meet and either add or mitigate certain actions, certain ideas. So for them, the notion of class composition is that one is only revolutionary insofar as one is engaging in revolutionary actions, and one is reactionary insofar as one is engaging in reactionary capitalist actions. If I steal a bunch of music off the internet, I'm engaged in a revolutionary action, right? Because I free myself of the exploitation of capital. If I buy from Walmart, I'm engaging in, even though I'm just a worker, I'm engaging in capitalist exploitation, right? Because by buying for Walmart, I'm propping up capital. And so for them, and many post-structuralists, the notion of class is really an interplay of various historical forces. And then, of course, finally, there's the sociological approach, which you can get from any modern sociologist. You can get it from Max Weber. And in this case, class is simply linked to a particular way of life. It's linked to social interactions. It's linked to worldviews. It's linked to their function in society. And so there's not really, for them, talking about the means of production is to totally miss the point. A factory worker doesn't have the same sort of class as an IT worker. One works in a cubicle, one has certain white-collar relationships, one engages in white-collar actions, the other is blue-collar, has certain predilections towards, cheaper beer or, cheap wine, but really beer. Whereas, these rich elites, have essentially a fundamentally different life, a fundamentally different class, and even workers amongst themselves. And so there's this sociological perspective, which attempts to undermine what they see as the easy and vulgar notion of orthodox Marxism. But with all of this information said, I think there's another way to look at class. Most people talk about class as an analysis, as a description of the way in which our world is constituted under capitalism. But I would contend that no analysis remains free of ideological distortion. There is no truth of the matter in this case which is free from a political will, a political ideology. So, I would also argue whatever determining characteristic one decides anchors one's ideological perspective. When one views the interplay of powers as the nature of class distinction, one is making a certain post-structural ideological move. When one sees consumption as the core of one's class, one is making another ideological move. I would argue a capitalistic ideological move. So in this case, I argue the return to orthodox Marxism, not because it's more descriptive, not because it necessarily gives us a predictive ability about what people will do in the future. But I advocate the return to traditional orthodox Marxist class structure as a call to arms. When one says that what it means to be a proletariat is to not have the means of production, one is doing nothing less than asserting that one's economic conditions are necessary for one's freedom. That if one does not control one's economic destiny, one does not control one's life. That one is nothing more than a slave and a serf to those with it, to those who own the means of production. And rather than drawing lines between this sort of life, between the redneck or the barrio dweller or the black projects, that as a political call, we should assert the unity of the proletariat against the bourgeois. That without this assertion, revolutionary action is not only unlikely, it is not only ineffective. That without the assertion of classic orthodox Marxism, revolution is impossible. Thank you very much.
Will you say a quick thing about those classless vagabonds?
Well, under traditional Marxist, Marx asserts that all classes will ultimately be separated into the bourgeois and the proletariat, the capitalist and the worker. But there's classes in between. For example, the petit bourgeois are those who own the means of their own reproduction. Right? So this would be a single shopkeeper who owns that, someone who blows glass, for example, or paints pictures. They don't own necessarily, right, a factory. They don't own other people's labor. They don't buy other people's labor, right? But a handmade cobbler, right, owns the means of his own production. Among the workers, there is another class, at least in the lower spectrum. It's called lumpen proletariat. The lumpen comes from the German word, I think it's lumpe, which means rags. But the lumpen proletariat in Marxist time literally meant something along the lines of the criminal workers or the mob. And so in this case, there are people who don't own the means of production as such, but survive as unproductive members. Drug dealers, shoplifters, which is not, again, to necessarily denigrate those actions. But in this case, there's no wider societal function. And in fact, in, I believe it's called the 19th of Brumaire, Marx says that as a matter of fact, the lumpen proletariat are most likely not to join with the workers, but to join with any reactionary leaders who come along and offer them a better deal. And in this case, I believe it was Napoleon III that Marx was talking about, who the lumpen proletariat formed his army. And it's also worth noting, right, Nazi Germany, Mussolini, it's a little bit different because there was a strong military element, but, right, Franco, Pinochet, right, all of these people had strong elements among, of criminality. right, and a strong base among the criminals. So in this case, right, those idlers, as Marx scornfully refers to them, are known as the lumpen proletariat. Does that answer your question? I'll field any questions by groups. Does this group have any questions?
Yeah.
Not so far.
Okay. You guys? All right. Any questions, objections back there?
I have a few, and I think you.
Okay. No.
You go ahead.
Please.
You go ahead first.
I was just wondering how nationalism falls into this idea of class with, I mean,
It's very easy to focus on American workers rather than
yeah,
China.
you were referring to American workers, and how you said like peasants don't really exist in America, but in southern Mexico, peasants still exist. And the idea of like
Absolutely.
So I'm talking about like industrial, like the workers of the world unite. I'm talking about like, well, how does nationalism fall? I don't really know Marx's theories on nationalism, like what he thought would end up with.
Well, there are two
borders and stuff.
Yeah, there are actually two big breaks that occur with Lenin. Now, keep in mind Marx died before this century began. And I believe Engels also died. And so their legacy was passed on to Karl Kautsky. And Karl Kautsky was this head of a really successful social democrat, because that's what the communists were called back then, the Social Democratic Party. And Lenin was this very marginal figure in this really pretty unsuccessful, social democratic party in Russia. Then World War I breaks out. And every good, honest communist is faced with this question, which is, what does one, as a communist, do when you have these various powers fighting each other? Now, the social democrats, right, who claim to be the Kautskyists, who claim to be good Marxists, said, well, look, here's the thing. If you don't go to war, right, your nation will be destroyed, and your industry will be destroyed, and your lives will be destroyed. So you go to war, but only tactically, for now, right, until, of course, we come together some point in the future after all these wars, and, then we can be friends. But you need to defend your country, right? You need to defend yourself. And so this was one view, right, which became what Lenin would call a social chauvinistic view. Lenin said, no, you don't need to defend your country. Not only do you not need to defend your country, you should actively work for your country to fail and lose. And you should not be concerned about your elites. You should not be concerned about your nation, about your position. You should be concerned about international solidarity with the workers. As I'm sure you can tell by how I characterize them, I am strongly in favor of that view, that it doesn't matter that I'm American. It is only a coincidental fact. And in fact, I talked to the Nepalese, and I said, what can I do to help aid you in your revolution in Nepal, right? I'm trained with weapons. I'm a good writer. I'd be more than willing to do, websites for them. And without exception, the Maoists said, the thing that you can do to protect us the best is go make revolution in your country. Because that's going to be the only thing that can defend us against American and Indian imperialism. So for me, at least, it is absolutely unimportant what sort of nationality we are, what sort of ethnicity we are. Again, class. For me, it's about class. And so I have more solidarity with Mexican peasants, literal peasants, maquiladora workers on the border, than I do with Ken Garf or anyone who has any power or importance here in Utah County, Utah, or the United States. Does that?
I was just curious.
Yeah. But there are different strains. Yeah.
Do you know where Lenin wrote about that?
Actually, the National Chauvinism, I believe he wrote about it. No, I'm not 2 steps forward, 1 step back. If you go to the Marxist Internet Archive, you can definitely find it in there, just in the war periods. It'll probably, I believe it's starred. Is it Imperialism, United States Capital? You can also definitely find aspects of it in State and Revolution. So State and Revolution is a good introduction to Leninist thought, and he also addressed the Kautskyist betrayal, essentially, is what he characterizes it as. So, State and Revolution, I highly recommend.
Just to start off, when you talk about orthodox Marxist, you outlined a bunch of different, and I just wondered, for you, is Lenin orthodox Marxist? Is his notion of class? Is Trotsky's, is Mao, like, how do those three, because I sensed in the other three that they definitely deviate from that. But I also sense that maybe these guys tried to make that a little bit more sophisticated rather than simplified.
Right.
Which I think Marx himself, at certain times, in certain of his writings, actually does provide a more sociological view, like, as you mentioned, with the lumping, he talks about the lumping proletariat and the petty bourgeoisie, but then at other times, when he's making the call to arms, he makes friends and foes.
Yeah.
And
oh, sorry.
I guess the way I'm reading you is maybe even though they looked at it in a more complex way than simply bourgeois proletariat, they did it in order to try to find a revolutionary class or to form a revolutionary class, whereas what you tend to what you're suggesting about the ultra-leftists, the pro-structuralists, and maybe the sociologists, is that they're trying to avoid. They're trying to say, this is why we can't have revolution.
Well,
and I just wondered if you...
Well, I want to give some...
Then I see that the Maoists and the post-structuralists, well, for one, I think the post-structuralists viewed themselves, maybe not Hardin-Avery, but the ones that were first called that, Lyotard aside, as Maoists. And that's where they were taking a cue from Mao. Yeah,
well, I mean, to give some credit to Negri and Hart, what a lot of the post-structuralists see, they see this as a problem with orthodox Marxism, which is it can become too dogmatic. That one is constantly searching for the real industrial workers, right, who are really the proletariat, and you dismiss out of hand everything else, right? Which Marx was accused of, which Lenin, of course, makes that next break that says, no, the peasants can have a tactical, right, alliance, but it's Mao that makes that serious break, which says, no, it's not about searching for this industrial purity, right? It's about forming the proletariat as a class, which entails accepting contingent that they subordinate their will to communist revolution, right, to the proletariat, other revolutionary classes, those classes that fight imperialism and in that respect protect the proletariat are revolutionary in those actions. Whereas those peasants that withhold food to starve out the cities to get what they want, in that instance would not be revolutionary, right? The contradiction there would have become antagonistic. So that's what they see. They see it as, right, an avoidance of dogmatism. But my contention is that in avoiding class as class, right, they render the very notion of revolution absurd. If we're judged by capitalist actions and communist actions, the biggest capitalist in the world, Bill Gates, is also the biggest communist in the world. Because nobody's given more money to people, nobody's built more infrastructure than Bill Gates. And so if one avoids the class analysis of class composition as such, I feel that we're left with nothing but sophistry and just an empty, vague void of which one can then ascribe anything to anything. And
so would it be because it's not about precision, it's about a call to arms, would it be to what extent would it be self-defining?
Well,
I mean, the problem with vulgar Marxism was not Marx, was not maybe some of the leading theoreticians, but within Marxist circles, people would be accusing each other of not being proletarian. Oh yeah, well, I know that your uncle happens to own this and that, so therefore you're not a true proletariat, or right? Those kind of accusations would fly, and thereby orthodoxy formed a certain sort of something you couldn't be, like a shame about this, that. Does that
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. In fact, one of the theoretical works I'm working on is how a rigid notion of class composition necessarily leads to Stalinism, to authoritarianism. I think Mao finds a way out of that. I think the radical contingency of contradiction, antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradiction, means that you don't have to accuse someone who owns a small business of being an exploiter if they use the money for that small business to buy guns for the revolutionaries, right? Or they fund resistance to anti-imperialism. But that's a big difference, right? Because you'll notice that serves the proletariat's interest.
Yeah.
Whereas, for example, Bill Gates' funds are consumptive, right? It's to feed people, it's to save them from malaria, but it's not to in any way alter the relationship of the means of production, right? And again,
And also, it doesn't, even if they make these distinctions or try to find some way to salvage class, they at least are still using class. Whereas the ultra-leftists and sociologists that find their way out of and Hart and Avery find their way out of class.
yeah,
Right? They in order to say we need to find something besides class.
exactly. Do you mind if I move on to the?
Yeah.
Did you gentlemen, any of you have questions, objections?
No, we had a good discussion about if there's any.
I've got a few things I'd like to address. Well, certainly there's a lot of, I think, just assumptions about, right, orthodox Marxism and all that. And maybe it's too contradictory and multifaceted to get into, but I'm interested, right? So, in light of last week's lecture, right? There's this. I'll just dive right in here, right? So, for Adorno and the whole Frankfurt School at large, right? You've got this. For them, individuality is a very it seems almost sacred thing, which is interesting, right? Well, anyways, but for them, right, the more that notions of individuality get emphasized, specifically in modern Western culture, what that is indicative of is the fact that people's individuality is actually deteriorating to the point it's almost non-existent. And this is tied up in the whole idea, right, that you've got this freedom, but really it's, you know, it's freedom of like brand names and freedom of consumption, but not really like freedom from consumption or freedom from. So anyways, I guess maybe you could address that, but what would be an orthodox? How would an orthodox Marxism begin to exhume notions of individuality versus maybe notions of identity that are more emphasis on like group identity?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. To be fair to the Frankfurt School, most of them thought that they were Orthodox Marxists. They saw themselves as Orthodox Marxists who had just reached a wall. They're like, hey, this industrial worker isn't rising up. Marx was wrong or incomplete in this respect, so we've got to do the culture work, right, that is necessary to explain why the proletariat aren't revolutionary. But this is, as I see Orthodox Marxism, this is a deviation. And this is one of the most dangerous deviations that has happened in the history of Marxism. Probably, I would say, more than Stalin, more than Pol Pot, more than any of them. This is the most dangerous deviation that has occurred in Orthodox Marxism, which is this transition from the means of production as the area of focus, right? Because there's an individuality that speaks to the means of production. If you own the means of production, you own the time that you go into work. Maybe not in a free, happy way in which anyone can do anything at any time and we can all eat ice cream, right? But if you own the means of production in a real and substantive way, even if it's through a council, even if it's mediated by the state, you have a level of individuality that one cannot gain regardless of your consumption. The thesis of orthodox Marxism is even a well cared for and well-fed slave is still a slave. And Adorno and Marcuse and those Western Marxists do a really good job about analyzing how being well-fed, right, and well-treated as a slave makes us want to continue to be slaves. But again, in doing so, they lose sight of the underlying and most important thesis, which is the call to class composition, the call to demand the means of production be in the hands of the workers, which is to say, I and those like me shall not be slaves. So does that answer, or give at least a gesture to answering your question?
It does. If I could maybe tack something onto that. Right, you talk about how this deviation from focusing on the means of production is dangerous. Initially, I mean, to defend them, Adorno, etc., I think the real culprit, though, right, the reason that project was so necessary for them is because, with the exception of the printing press, mass media just wasn't the force in the world that it was during Marx's life, right? Radio and certainly even television, and I think we're seeing the internet being co-opted as well. But right, and for them that was the culprit. That was the reason that people were necessarily misrecognizing their class. So, but I guess the reason I think maybe that's warranted and not so dangerous. What about people whose labor, right, is increasingly becoming, right, in the sort of service sector, and how do you identify these people as, you know, the proletariat?
Well, yeah, actually that's, do you mind if we make this the last question for the sake of moving on to these gentlemen?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Well, this is actually the criticism that I'd have of Adorno and Marcuse. They focus, and of course, I would highly recommend looking into Marxist notions of base superstructure. This is what they're working with. But what they focus on is how workers consume mass media, almost without exception. Their essays are about, I mean, there's in fact an essay which, if I have it correctly, is verbatim, how to watch television. They are focused on, you know, jazz, on movies, on music, on the reproduction of art. That's all consumptive. There are ways in which one can deal with mass media that deal not with mass media as consumption, but mass media as production. And this, of course, right, would extend to the service sector. The key of the service sector is not to pretend that they are a fake part of the economy, right? And to focus on how, you know, being forced to have someone smile and wave at you and greet you at Walmart is affecting your subjectivity. The real question is, how does one liberate the means of production, right? The site of production, in this case of affect, of, you know, distribution, Walmart. How does one liberate that from the service of capital? And so in this case, I think Adorno, and giving Benjamin some exception, and maybe that's just a personal preference, they fail. They are engaged in consumptive analysis, and I think that's a wrong track to take, and I think that's a dangerous deviation. But the history of Western Marxism basically says I'm wrong, so we should include that as well. So, gentlemen.
I was wondering if you were differentiating the last perspective you talked about, the ideological perspective, from orthodox Marxism, and if you could explain that a little more.
Well, basically, my perspective on ideology is one that it permeates all perspectives. So whether you're engaged in sociology or consumptive analysis you are always engaged in ideology. So rather than search for this purity from ideology, we assume it as a given and we follow it to its end, which is if we have to assume an ideology, which I believe we do, the ideology to assume is orthodox Marxism in this case, and to follow it to the end, which is the liberation of the